Welcome to another Museum FAQ video. I'm Paul Orselli, President and Chief Instigator at POW, Paul Orselli Workshop, here on Long Island. And we Zoom electronically all the way to the West Coast to be speaking with Eric Siegel today. How are you, Eric?
I'm feeling great. It's 75 degrees and sunny here, which I could bore you with pretty much every day.
That's it. Well, like, good for you. I wish the weather was like that here today, but it's not.
The only thing we got to add sometimes is 75 degrees and sunny and smoke-filled skies.
Yeah, well, you also are living in the shake and bake capital of the world, so there we are. But yeah, I know. Thanks. Hope you enjoy that weather. We normally like to start out by hearing about people's background because I always think it's interesting. Usually people involved in the museum business don't necessarily have a perfectly straight line trajectory. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about your background and then we will launch into the main conversation.
Yeah, sure. So I actually I have one of the straighter lines into the museum world, more intentional lines. I didn't kind of drift accidentally into that world. I was born in New York and raised in New York and in the suburbs. And from the time I was a little kid, you know, what I did with my parents first, and then when I was on my own, is I went to museums. I just, you know, New York is just amazing that way. I'd go into Central Park and go to, you know, decide whether I want to go to the Met or whether I want to go to natural history or whether I want to go up to the Goog, or, you know, it was just like a luxury. And, you know, I really remember, you know, the ways in which my mind was expanded. One of the ones I remember most vividly, and this will relate to this conversation, is going to, I think it was actually the Whitney, and they had part of their permanent installation, I'm not going to remember the name of the artist, was a pile of broken glass on the ground. You know, and I remembered like looking at this saying like, clearly there's something going on in the museum world that I just, you know, it's not like any other place I've been. Like that would not be something that they would put on display. And so, you know, that was kind of like a beginning of an engagement with what museums are and the sort of parameters of what belongs in a museum, which again relates a little bit to our background to the extent. And I got an undergraduate degree in music. I'm a composer. I'm still an active musician, and studied a lot of ethnomusicology, and came out actually to the West Coast and played for a year or two, worked as a musician, and then decided that you know, the hours weren't for me, and I went to a program that SUNY Binghamton had called MBA Arts Administration. So I have an MBA. And the intention was to go work, actually, my first thought was the Performing Arts Organization. But my first job out of school was at the Bronx Museum of the Arts, which we were just starting at that point. So I was part of the team that helped to start that and move us into a lapsed synagogue in the South Bronx. And that, again, you know, really was at the intersection of contemporary art and sort of the politics and sociology of that community. You know, it wasn't just a straight up art gig. So, art museum gig. And I was then I moved to Wave Hill, which I'll talk about some more, as a public garden in the Bronx, the New York Botanical Garden. So I spent a lot of time in botanical gardens. Then I went to work with Alan Friedman, who's another pivotal person in this discussion at the New York Hall of Science. We had worked on a project together, and he invited me to come over there and work. And so I was a very fruitful 17 years. So that was the largest part of my career, and then came to the West Coast for family reasons, actually. I was hired by the university to run the botanical garden here, which I did for 3 years, and then did some other consulting work for the university. So I've had a relatively straight line into the museum world, and, you know, consider myself to be incredibly fortunate to have been able to raise a couple of kids and, you know, live a pretty good life. I right now, is sort of nothing I wish more than that other people who are coming up now can do the same, you know, and that's a challenge. It's something that I've been sort of staying engaged with, trying to help mentor younger people. So,
Great. Well, it's interesting in some ways, a straight line, but also as a musician and then into museums, always the arts. But so you mentioned some of the illustrious places you've worked, which is great. And I want to dig into some of the projects and some of the ways you think about working on projects and with communities at museums, because as we mentioned, as we were talking together before the recording started, I said, do you know, I think of certainly some of your projects, and maybe you'll tell us, many or most, as not the usual suspects. And so, you know, when I think of a science museum, especially, that has gone out of its way to maybe pick some of the most difficult and esoteric topics to delve into, that would be the New York Hall of Science. And so I think I'd be interested in maybe you talking a little bit about what is it that drove you, or how did things happen that you latched onto some projects that might not be considered traditional projects in either a botanical garden or a science center, a science museum, or even, as you mentioned, with Wave Hill, something that wasn't just a straight up art organization. So there, I've given you a
wide playing field. Yeah,
I've given you a good mushy open field to right. tread on. I hope you don't slip.
A wide runway. Right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, actually, and fortunately, you know, I think this is a great. I'm grateful to be able to talk about things this way, because it's helped me to think through some of the things that have excited me, and again, with an eye towards, you know, how do you get other people excited about the museum world, and which, you know, people really do think of it as probably more narrowly focused than I've ever had to, and you know, this original story that I mentioned about going to the Guggenheim Museum and seeing these things that really just it was, I didn't care about its context in the art world. I was just really, you know, this pile of broken glass. I was really fascinated by sort of what's the context, what are we trying to say here, what's this about, what am I supposed to walk away with, you know? And I picked a particularly thorny one to work with. But,
I'm just laughing when you mentioned that earlier. I thought, man, if you would have been inside a science museum, somebody would just say, oh no, somebody broke one of the exhibits.
Right. No, this was a piece of contemporary art. There wasn't even a rope around it, strangely enough. It was just sitting there. And that same artist now has installations at the Beacon, which is another one of my favorite places. So, just, you know, I was never like an aesthete that much, you know. It wasn't like the aesthetic stimulation of looking at a picture. Never really what excited me about being involved in museums. It was always sort of, what are we trying to do here? You know, it's a weird institution. You know, a museum is a weird institution. We know some of the history of it. You know, it comes up from these Wunderkammers in the, you know, the province of the wealthy amateur collector. And in the last century, you know, it's become much more of a socially motivated, you know, or types of organizations, ideally socially motivated. So, you know, I grew up sort of at the crux of the time when museums were engaging, you know, starting to engage meaningfully with the community. And, you know, if any of your viewers haven't read Making the Mummies Dance by Thomas Hoving, it's a really incredibly enlightening story about a museum, the Metropolitan Museum's relationship to its community. And as a matter of fact, I was the beneficiary of that, because what happened is that the Met wanted to build out into the park, and there was a lot of controversy about that. And the community activists at the time came to an agreement that if they built into the park, they'd have to build these satellite museums around the rest of the city. And I actually worked at, you know, arguably 3 of those satellite museums. And so I never worked in Manhattan. Here I'm a New Yorker. I work in museums. I never worked in Manhattan. I always assumed I would. But eventually it's sort of, this is an interesting specialty. You know, I'm working at these places, in communities which are not always poor. I mean, Wave Hill is not in a poor community, but they're outlying communities. But most of the communities I worked in actually were really immigrant communities. So they always had this very intentional social focus to them. So that's one, you know, one direction into this question. And another is, you know, botanical gardens, which museum people don't think of very much at all, are really problematic and interesting places. They tend to be the preserve of sort of a small coterie of horticultural people with horticultural interest, and have very little relationship to the world around them. So the first place after the Bronx Museum that I worked, and that's an amazing story, but probably take too long to tell. Wave Hill was set up. It was set up as a park originally, and then became a cultural institution in New York, which had a whole administrative thing going on. And its first sort of programs were things like Allen Ginsberg performing naked in Wave Hill, and there are posters around of this. It was like, well, here's this botanical garden, and here are these, pretty cutting edge, provocative cultural happenings. And that's one example. But we also had many other really thought-provoking programs. The Allen Ginsberg thing was way before my time. The director who hired me was a man called Peter Sauer. And Peter Sauer created a mission for Wave Hill, which I still find very resonant. And in that mission, he tried to, I won't try to quote it, but what he tried to do is he tried to drive home the point that the landscapes in which we all live and work, even if you live very remotely in what you consider to be a wilderness, are the intersection of human intention and the natural world. And that, in fact, human intention and the natural world are bound together in a way that is not always obvious. So, the fact that there are wilderness preserves in the United States is, as we see under the political situation, is a human intention that makes that happen. As we enter this Anthropocene age, there's no part of the world that isn't affected by human intention, and that's a whole other rant. But so the mission of Wave Hill was to draw people's attention to the fact that a garden is kind of a distillation of the interaction between human culture and the natural world. So here we are, we're managing the natural world in a collaborative process. Plants only do what they want to do, but we have to understand what they want to do, and we have to understand how to display them. And we want to create certain aesthetic/emotional effects. So we wanted to make people feel happy to be there. We wanted to see that it was beautiful. In the event, it turns out to be one of the leading horticultural showplaces in the world because of the work of some really brilliant horticulturists, which I didn't know anything about horticulture at all. And so that was my first exposure to the idea that you can tap meaning out of things that people think they already understand, that maybe they didn't know were there, right? So, and that was very inspirational to me. And it's changed the way I see the world. If you live in the suburbs, for example, a lot of the traces of pre-suburban development are effaced. And so you can grow up thinking you're living in a place where there's no history. But there clearly is history, and you have to look, and it adds richness to your understanding of the landscape. So the whole issue of landscape history, landscape and culture turned out to be, and it was a field that was growing up just as I was learning about it. And again, another book called Changes in the Land by William Cronon is an unbelievable book for understanding how our understanding of landscape grew up, particularly in the Northeast. So again, that was another example of sort of an intersection of what we were doing. When I went to the New York Botanical Garden, Gregory Long, who was the director at the time and incredible activist in the cultural world and institutional developer, was the president. And what's the name of the botanical garden in Jamaica Plains? The one was designed by Olmsted. It's part of Harvard. Anyway, and they had just gotten an NEH grant, and I was working for Gregory as a fundraiser, and everybody who worked for Gregory worked for him as a fundraiser, and whether they knew it or not, but that was explicitly my job. And he came into my office one day. He said, "Look, the Arnold Arboretum, which is this place, just got $250,000 from the NEH. You go out and get us $250,000.
Yeah, you better get on it, man. They got the money. You better get us some money."
Yeah, that's pretty much the way it was. And so what we ended up by doing was doing a cultural reading of the landscape at the New York Botanical Garden, which really had not been done at all. It was all about a museum of plants, as they called it, which meant sort of this is a pine, this is the type of pine, this is an azalea, this is the type of azalea,
and here's 50 other types of pines and azaleas,
and that's what they
for you to
thought.
look
That's
at.
what they thought of being Museum of Plant meant. They thought it meant sort of a decontextualized sort of specimen by specimen. Sort of the oldest understanding of how a museum might work, as if you were in a museum of paintings and all they had, like the Frick, was the label, the label, the label, no contextual information at all, and that works for the people who already love it, but doesn't do anything for the people who don't love it.
Yeah.
So we came up with this. We got a grant from the NEH to do a landscape.
Good job.
Yeah, man. It only took about 3 years. That's pretty much what I did there, and it was which proposed a really deep and rich cultural interpretation of the landscape, and there were some wonderful advisory group moments. For example, we had a what they called the first growth forest, which is a vexed term anyway, a hemlock forest, and forests for Americans have this kind of romance, but forests for Europeans are actually scary places. And when the first Europeans came to the United States to colonize, their feeling about they kept on pushing back the edge of forest. That's what the project was to push back the edges of forest, and they were scared of forests. And so we went back to sort of the literature of how people feel when they're in the woods, right? And again, we have a tendency to sort of say, "Oh, it's wonderful to be in the woods. It's so far away from everything. It's just so great." But for most people, for most of civilization, the woods was where you were when you didn't have a home. It was not a good place to be, and it was wilderness was not a fun place for most people. And so there was this feeling of fear, and you could see it in things like the Grimm fairy tales, the wolf in the forest, right? And you cross into the forest and you cross into this dangerous place. Now, sure enough, when we ask our current visitors to talk about, and then for the colonial settlers, the Indians were in the forest, they were scared of them. This is being hyper simplified, but so you ask our current visitors, and we did a lot of this. So, what do you feel about going into the forest? They say, we're scared. What are you scared of? We're scared of the people who live in the Bronx, who might be in the forest, who are going to hurt us. There's never been any burglary in the forest. There's never been any problems. There's never been any violence in the. But it's the same thing where they project their fears onto the forest. So this was fascinating to me. This was like a whole different way of thinking about what a forest is. In the event, we did all this planning. We had all kinds of committees and groups meeting, both staff and outside, and advisors. And I submitted it to the president, and he said, "This is bullshit. This makes no sense to me at all. This is not what I want to do with the museum," and I quit. So
take your money. I'm out of here.
Yeah. And they did something else with the money, and it was a little bit tricky because it's tricky. But so I mean, it's not quite as simple as that. But it was clear that I wasn't going to be able to do the work that I wanted to do, and what they wanted me to do was not what I wanted to do. So Alan Friedman at the New York Hall of Science hired me. Now, I think probably a lot of the people who watch you may know Alan by name or may have known him. He died suddenly. I guess it's about 10 years ago now. I worked literally in the office next door to him, and for 10 years or so. And he had his career started. He was an engineer, PhD, physicist, applied physics and engineer, so really applied physicist. And when he got his PhD, he, instead of going into a postdoc for material science or applied physics, he got a postdoc from I think it might have been an NEH to do a book about Einstein and society. And he was very explicit that all the interesting stuff is at what he called the interstices. It's at the places where dissimilar things meet. He was very intentional about that. Now, he was also a complete science geek, so he was the one responsible, for example, for the quantum atom model. So
yeah.
I'm not sure,
What's this?
Check. Yeah. So, but I found that to be true. I found what he was describing is at least suited my temperament for what I wanted to do. So
the edges the edges and the interstitial spaces are I agree with him. Those are the interesting places to be. That's where interesting things happen.
Well, it's actually it's going back to the earlier discussion about the forest and you know, native people have this image of the United States having been a pristine wilderness and the natives just hunted and gathered and all this stuff. But in fact, they managed very intensively. And one of the things they did was they managed forests by burning the edges, burning them, so that there'd be more edges. And the reason they wanted edges is because that's where there's the most diversity of plants and flora and fauna. So there's an analogy to be made that, you know, the edges are where the diversity is, so we.
But I just want to say something. This is interesting. I never thought about this. Like, I appreciate everything you just said about the forest, because like when I worked at Cranbrook outside of Detroit, and kids from Detroit would come, and it wasn't like Cranbrook was like some pristine forest, but they would be really scared that they were in the woods instead of in the city. I mean, so I mean, why do you think? I would say museum people are scared of the woods or the edges in a way. I mean,
yeah, I think. Well, I think there's a good reason, and probably, you know, not as good a reason. The good reason is, and this is something that we grappled with a lot at the Hall of Science. You know, when you're dealing with an audience that is, you know, doesn't spend all their time thinking about this. So whether it's the school children or families, they're coming to see an exhibit about X, you know, and they're coming to see I want to see the exhibit about the human body. I want to see the exhibition about, and if you throw them a lot of stuff that is ambiguous or raises more questions than it answers, you risk leaving a lot of people behind and like making them dissatisfied. So, you know, as much as I'd like to say, well, it's because, you know, museum people aren't really thinking deeply enough. I actually think there's different types of museum people. Some are really more focused on, you know, how are things going to be received, and others are more focused on what, you know, kind of what do I think is an interesting thing to do.
Yeah.
I plead guilty to the second. As a matter of fact, you once said something to me that stuck in my mind. We were at some event at the Hall of Science, and you know, we were talking about the next step in exhibits, and I said, you know, people just aren't interested in, you know, the regular suite of exhibits anymore. And you looked at me and said, they're bored with it. And you looked at me and said, I think you're bored with it.
Yeah.
You know?
I know. I mean, you know, you wonder, like, oh, okay, every science center has a gravity well or that. And I'm like, yeah, because it's a great exhibit. I don't care if I've seen it before. Like, it's still fun to put those balls in there.
And also incredibly meaningful. You know, I mean, there's an incredible amount of meaning you can take out of it. So, though it's, yeah, anyway, so there's a lot to be said about the sort of misapprehensions that you get from physics exhibits. But the long and the short of it is, though, that I think, you know, these kinds of complicated, I think museums have, smart museums have an appetite that goes like this. I want the bread and butter, and I want the, you know, frog's legs. I mean, you know, I want the stuff that's like straight up, people get it, and I want some of the stuff that's going to really be thought provoking and, you know, and keeps our. I always argue that the reason to do this innovative stuff, you know, which we tried to keep our eye on at the Hall of Science in particular, is because it keeps the staff engaged. You know, it keeps it like, that's what our staff was really good at, so let's keep them bubbling. And so that, you know, that's not a great argument for funding, but internally, you know, is the argument I've often made.
But if you yourself, as an institution or a developer, aren't interested in something, how in the world do you expect the visitors? Like, you know, if you're just sort of sleepwalking through a project, it's like, you know, okay, the person who put this together didn't really care about it, and neither do I. So, yeah.
Well, and you know, and I think at this time there was a particular blossoming. You know, so by this time I would say like the 80s and 90s, and into the turn of the century, and still continues, blossoming of sort of this hybrid art technology stuff. You know,
there's another edge.
Yeah, no, exactly right. And so I was lucky enough to teach for a little while at ITP in New York, which was one of the real hotbeds of that kind of intersection. And you know, so going to your point, you know, there are a large cohort of people who are working with varying degrees cutting edge technology. And now you look at VR and AR, but not necessarily not necessarily that. Who really are drawn to the what can we communicate using this technology? So that's another thing that the Hall of Science. Alan always was interested in that, and I was too, and certainly Margaret now has been for a couple of decades. And so we always tried to do things that would integrate art and technology. The biggest example of that you would see at the Hall of Science now is the Connected World, which is this huge installation done by a pair of people who are just exactly that. They're artists and technologists, and our staff worked very closely with them. And if you can put a link in the thing to Connected Worlds,
we're on YouTube. There will be links and references below.
yeah, it's worth checking out. For those who don't have any visual sense of it, it's very hard to describe what it is, but it's stunning, and it took a huge amount of work. So that was one of those projects that was just like, well. So let's talk about another part of this for a second. And I've been thinking about this. So I had this idea. We had this great room we needed to work, and I wanted to do something about visualization. And we tried all these different ideas to get people to participate, and it was just really hard to do. And one of the things, I don't have an answer for this, but one of the things that I think is really worth museum people grappling with is, what do you do when you have a good idea? Like, how do you make a good idea into something that really happens? No matter where you are, and this is something that I've talked to a lot of students about, no matter where you are in the museum hierarchy, I'm assuming you're in the museums because you have ideas you want to communicate. And that's not true. Well, sorry. But, what is the strategy? What is the thing you do? Can you model taking something from a vague conception, because the world is filled with good ideas that don't get executed, and making it happen. And Connected Worlds had a very clear path that way, and the path led through, and I really want to give her credit, it led through Margaret, who saw the vision of this thing, and every time we said here's a limitation, she just said like, well, blow through it, and so we that's the core sort of way to get stuff like that done, big, complicated, unprecedented, for better or worse, unprecedented stuff, is having a great team of people who are convinced. And the core job of somebody like me is to be able to articulate what we're trying to do in order to convince those people.
Yeah, but it's interesting what you just said about Margaret, because other people I've spoken to in these museum FAQ things, and I'm thinking of Stuart Colhagen in Australia and his work around the world with different communities. He said a variation of what you said. It's like, okay, where do we want to go? And what is in the way? What's between us and our ultimate goal? And now our job is to figure out a way around or to eliminate that impediment so we get to our goal. And so I think if you are a person who, if you sort of frame the world like that, like what's in the way of me making something I really want to happen. And, a lot of times museum people think it's money, but it's not always money. It's thinking about things in different ways. So you can I can get around this thing without raising $1 million.
Well, so my experience is similar to that, but a little bit different. And it's not, certainly I didn't mean to imply we needed to sort of get around Margaret or get through it. She was actually... No,
I mean the impediments, not Margaret.
So Margaret was it was the opposite of an impediment in this case. But I think I see it more as, how do you convince the people that need to be convinced? And it's just like, okay, my argument isn't good enough. It's not clear enough. It's ignoring some important element, like this is way too expensive. I just need to and it's an iterative process. So anyway, so what we had there was a team of people who were willing to think, were eager to think expansively about what this could be, and then great consultants and a great project. And I could point to a few others at the Hall of Science, but two others I want to talk about there. One is in terms of the intersectionality of different things. So some of you and some of my friends who are on this know, I have a daughter who has cerebral palsy, and she's a lawyer now, and she's doing great. But it's a big thing, It's a challenge, and certainly when she was younger, it was really a big part of our emotional energy went to trying to make sure that she had a life that suited her abilities, and so I started to think she had this really crappy. She uses a walker to get around. And she uses the same thing now. It's not very good, and I started to think there's got to be a better way to get around for her. And at that time, MIT. John Hockenberry had gone to work at MIT, and who uses a wheelchair himself, and was starting to run a program there to try to get technologists to think about how prosthetics, writ large, support the way we live. Now, you and I could point around our room to, including to our computer screen and our earbuds, to things that are prosthetics, right? I couldn't hear you if I didn't have this prosthetic.
Yeah.
I couldn't see you if I didn't have this prosthetic. Shoes are a prosthetic because you can't walk very far without them. I mean, there's all these things that turn out to be prosthetics that you didn't even think of as being prosthetics that people who don't have any disability use.
So it's interesting. I'm just curious, not to break the flow, but why would you use the term prosthetic instead of, for example, assistive device?
Yeah, I think I use it partly for its shock value.
Yeah, it does have a shock value.
Yeah, I think I want I don't want to sort of bland it out. It's like we think of a prosthetic as an artificial limb,
right?
And in this case, it's artificial hearing, it's artificial seeing. I wear a prosthetic every day. Why is this prosthetic so much more socially acceptable than other kinds of prosthetics? And so we had a very intense planning process that we did with some consultants, including Joe Heimlich, who was the very empathetic evaluator and researcher with this, on this, and a group of 8 or 10 young people with disabilities who met 3 or 4 times and really set us straight on some stuff. It's like, we don't want an exhibition about heroics. We don't want an exhibition about the blind guy who climbs the Himalayas. It's just like, it makes us feel worse. It's like, because that's just like, that guy's an outlier anyway. What can he say? We want to talk about what daily life is like, and we want to probe the ethics of using prosthetics in everyday life, and also look at some of the technologies that are around the corner. So, that for me was an exploration of engineering, and I submitted this proposal to NSF 4 times, which is I think they don't know of any proposals that have been submitted more often. And
let's just give this guy the money. We're tired of hearing from him.
That was kind of like that. Actually, it was pretty funny. I had gotten turned down the 3rd time, and a friend of mine from NYU was there, and I said, "Oh man, I'm just so disgusted. I think I'm going to give up." He said, "No, this is what you do. You just shove it in there until they're sick of it." So,
but it goes back to what you were just talking about before. I mean, like, this is my goal, and to make this happen, if I need to submit this thing 50 goddamn times, I'm going to submit it.
Yeah. Yeah, and really, to be honest, the program officers they were always like, "This is a really good proposal. Let's see if we can get it done." And they were very supportive by and large.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't have done it had I not gotten that feedback. And it's the exhibition, and I'm pleased we partnered with OMSI on this while they were still building exhibitions, and they did a great job. And the exhibition is still touring. This is now, I think, 8 years later. And
so say the name of it again.
It's called Human Plus: Real Lives, Real Engineering, and you can find it by looking at the OMSI website. And there's a great teacher's guide that we put together for doing engineering.
We'll include links and stuff.
Yeah, for including engineering in younger people's curriculum. There's this idea going around also at the Hall of Science, with Margaret had started not long before, that engineering that's focused on real life problems as opposed to abstract problems, was more likely to engage, particularly girls. And I always questioned that, but that was part of the motivation for this. So anyway, that's Human Plus, and please check it out, particularly the guide. And I think it's still going to tour for a little bit more if they can.
That's awesome.
Well, they get duct tape and chewing gum.
the things you said about connected worlds and the things you said about Human Plus and everything else you said. I mean, this actually, considering that we're coming out of hopefully coming out of a worldwide pandemic, I mean, this is actually a very hopeful conversation. That's the way I'm taking it, because it sort of tells people that you need to keep at it. But if you keep at it, you know, if you really want to make something happen, if you keep at it, you really can. I mean, I don't want to sort of turn this conversation into a retelling of the little engine that could, but in a way, it sort of is.
Well, I think since we're here in the second decade of the 21st century, and we're very interested in diversity, equity, and access, and we're sort of learning more about this. One of the things that's really interesting is who has the confidence and the institutional oomph to be able to push this, And I have a little story about that, which I'm sure it's taking too much time, but the story is I went to the Museums in the Web conference, and I was giving a talk on just this subject: who gets to propose topics? How do you get at the table? And I had spent the previous 3 days with technologists saying that their projects never get funded, they don't have any, and so I said, okay. At the end of my talk, I said, anybody who has, I said, prepare a 2-page document on your project. I will review it with you. You send it to me. I will review it with you by email, free advice, and help you think about strategies for communicating it better and moving it ahead. Not a single person sent me. Right?
I didn't want to hear that story.
Yeah. So there is a tropism towards just assuming that you're powerless and not want to take the first steps towards trying to get some power. So that I think it was very telling. I thought, and I'm not that would be true of educators, that would be true of exhibits people, that would be true of virtually anybody in our world. So to move on quickly to a couple of other, and one of the ones you mentioned at the beginning, or maybe it was before the conversation. There was this cool thing called Sci-Fu camp, and it was the Friends of O'Reilly put on a camp at Google every summer, and my wife used to say, like, what are you doing going there, And I said, well, it's 200 of the smartest people in the world and me, So it was Nobel Prize winners, it was all these people people you've heard of, and somehow it was because of our work with Maker Faire, and I got invited.
Hey man, you got in. It doesn't matter how you got in, you were there.
Right. It's talk about what do they call it, Imposter Syndrome. And I met Peter Neufeld, and Peter Neufeld is the founder of the Innocence Project. And Peter Neufeld was there because he wanted money from Google. I mean, that's why he was there. But he wanted help from Google for some projects they were working on. But our conversation sitting outside the Mountain View campus was, the science of criminal justice is terrible. It barely deserves the name of science. In many cases, doesn't deserve the name of science, because all of the science that's been developed for the courtroom has been developed for the courtroom. It was developed in a polemic, it's developed to prove a point. So, hair, material, even at the FBI was the one who led the fingerprint science.
Meant to throw people into prison.
Right, or used that way. And the one that wasn't is DNA. DNA was developed outside the courtroom, and therefore has turned out to be the most solid in the criminal justice system. So, for those of the people who don't know, the Innocence Project, Peter Neufeld, have gotten at this point maybe 300-400 people off of death row who were falsely convicted, who can be proven to be falsely convicted through DNA evidence, typically of capital offense. And that's just the New York chapter.
And so you met him and said, "Oh, this would make a great exhibit."
Well, actually, I didn't. And I said this would people should know about this, but I don't think it's a good exhibit. And I didn't really. It was sort of an idea without a format. He has a friend, Jim Dwyer, who unfortunately passed away, who's a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter in New York. And he said, "Well, maybe we could do a book about this." And I said, "People don't read a book." And I think it's just like another book. And
no, I don't think so.
so no, so I
like, hey, how'd this guy get into this event?
Right, exactly. Throw him out. And so, but Apple had just come out with this interactive book format, this iBook format. And so this was another one of those things. Like, I had an idea, I figured out. I mean, I don't want to take too much credit, but I had a funder in mind. We had access to the funder. We argued. We sort of went back and forth. We had some connections. We did our fundraising. We got money, and we produced a book that's still available on the Apple. It's free now on the Apple Store, the Apple Book Store, which most people don't even go to, and you can read it using Apple Book Reader, which is on Macs and iPads. And I want to give a shout out to Jarrell Abernator, who is the producer of the book at the Hall of Science, and a couple other people, obviously did a huge amount of work. Jim Dwyer was the author of the book, and Peter Neufeld and the Innocence Project. And this is an extraordinary thing that has gotten no attention. It's in a lot of ways it's the deepest thing that I've ever been involved with, in that it just puts its finger on on these miscarriages of justice that have caused people untold misery. I could go into detail, but I really do want to be mindful of the time. But I do want to encourage people, of all the projects that I've been involved with, this is one that I really think it's still available, and it's easy to get a look at if you have a
We're
Mac.
going to provide the information and this added incentive for people to find out about. Well, in our closing moments here, I don't want to close out before you tell me at least a little teaser so that we can give people more information about this project you're working on related to, I'm going to say, caregivers.
That's right. Yeah. So we started an organization, as in we have an LLC, called Care::Work, and it has a website which we'll give you, careworkproject.org, and the intention is to foreground the caregivers in our world, in our midst. I've been the beneficiary of caregivers throughout my whole life, from the time I was an infant. I had working parents, to now with my daughter with a disability, and I'm sure we'll need them again. And my experience has been that they have been almost always extraordinary people, and who never have gotten the kind of gratitude.
Yeah, that's a tough job.
Yeah,
that's a very tough job.
It's a really tough job. It takes an extraordinary person to do it. But the other thing about it that's a little bit more strategic, I guess I would say, is that it's one of the few places where wealthy people and really poor people share experience.
Sure.
And so in your house, you're a person who's been in the professional class all your life. You have a sick parent. In your house is somebody who is, comes from a completely different background and lives in an entirely different economic life than you live. And
who is helping you out?
Who's more than helping you. I was making your life possible in a lot of ways. I still want to go to work, right? And so I mean, it's very powerful. And fortunately, there's an organization of sort of equal stature called the National Domestic Workers Alliance, who I also want to put down there, who has been doing great work bringing this to the fore, and has actually gotten laws passed. The caregivers are not protected by any federal OSHA regulations at this point.
Yeah, I'll just underline again: tough work, undercompensated, in oftentimes very difficult situations.
Right, and with abuse and racism, penetrating the whole thing. So the National Domestic Workers Alliance has been doing yeoman's work. I've been supporting them any way I can, and so this exhibition. Or this idea for Care Work is to create traveling exhibitions or public exhibitions featuring photographs of caregivers, ideally with the people that they're caring for. And so we have our inaugural exhibition right now in New York City. They're on these digital billboards in Brooklyn, throughout Brooklyn, and you can see them for the next couple of weeks on there. That's through a partnership with Link NYSCI, and we're planning another one for out here in the West Coast. And we're just going to be issuing an open call for photographers, for anybody who wants to think about this as a topic for photography. I think it's a very poignant and powerful topic, and we'll be, we have an honorarium and all that stuff. And this is my current, I guess, interdisciplinary project, in the sense it's art in the service of social justice. And so far the people that I've been fortunate to work with, and the people who've been helping out with it, have been great. And this has been another instance of, okay, here's an idea. What do you do to make this idea come to fruition? And this one's been cooking for 3-4 years now. And so, I think if I was going to lead with any two things, anything, with what you said before, Paul, it's like you really should be doing stuff you're interested in. That would really be ideal. and everything sort of follows from that. If you're really interested in it, you'll learn how to get it done.
I don't feel like I have left too many exhibit ideas on the shelf. I might have had to change the implementation or like the structure or the funding or whatever. But if it's something that I thought was a good idea, an important idea, an essential idea for a place that I was working in or for, you'd figure a way to do it. I don't want to oversimplify, because like you say, it often takes years and a lot of hard work from a team of people. It's not like Superman swoops in and drops these bags of money at your feet. Yeah. But I really encourage folks, let's leave on that positive note, to
pursue their ideas. And I encourage people in our generation,
push for your ideas.
Yeah. And encourage people in our generation to make space and give encouragement and support for people who are coming up, who have their ideas, and don't disparage them because they're not familiar. I think that's the last part's a little bit difficult because the world has changed so quickly, and a lot of people might, who are in the generation we're in, it's just out of habit. We don't see things the same way. And I think there's so much space, and I would love for people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s to feel as empowered and to have as sort of much excitement in this profession as I think you've had, and I feel like I've had.
Well, I don't want to inadvertently open the floodgates, but I'm just going to say, if what we said resonates with people, you can find us, contact us.
Yeah, absolutely. That's right. Yeah, and I want to give a shout out also that Jenny Sayre and I both, through NAME, have these morning coffee things. Mine's on Thursday, West Coast, 10 o'clock time, and Jenny Sayre's in the East Coast, Wednesdays. And they're really great forums to air ideas, to get support, and to meet people. So if you're watching this and you're interested, check that out. It will be in the.
Yeah, I was going to say this is an added incentive to go through the links and references below. But that's great. Yep. Well, thank you, Eric. Always nice to see you and speak with you. I appreciate you. Not only sharing some war stories, us old guys, we get to share the war stories, but I think also that through line of figuring out what you want to do and figuring out what you have to do to make it happen is on one hand, it sounds simplistic, but I think most of the projects that you and I have worked on either separately or together have happened in that way. So
yeah, that's right.
Cool.
All right, man. Well,
thanks very much.
Yeah. Thanks for doing this, by the way, Paul. I know everybody out here in the rest of the world and Zoom land appreciates it. So YouTube land.
Thank you. That's great. Take care.